Last week we looked at the Old Testament book of Song of Songs, and we saw how it's probably the least used book in the entire Bible. And we saw that it's about one thing: sexual desire between an adolescent boy and an adolescent girl. We saw that the book of Song of Songs never mentions God and never mentions religion. There's another book in the Old Testament that doesn't mention God or religion, and that is the book of Esther. And I was requested to talk about Esther today. Now, the book of Esther is rarely used. As I said, it does not talk of God or religion. It concerns a Jewish woman who married the king of Persia and became the queen of Persia. She became a heroine to the Jewish people, and she is commemorated in the Jewish observance that is called Purim. Now, Purim usually takes place in mid-March, so we're a little behind that. Now, there is some disagreement about when the events in the book of Esther actually took place. It's set in Persia. That's in the Middle East. It is in the area of what is now Iran. But it says that he reigned from Babylon and then on down into Ethiopia and then on to India. So there was a huge empire centered there in Iran. Now, the exact name of the king, Ahasuerus, that we heard in our Bible reading, is not mentioned in the historical record. The majority of biblical scholars, though, believe that the book of Esther was set sometime between 486 and 424 BC. And if that is the case, then that would make it the latest of the Old Testament books. Now, the events it recounts then are the latest events of the Old Testament. Now, if you remember your Old Testament history, the Hebrews left Egypt under Moses. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. They entered the Promised Land under Joshua. And then they gradually, over several hundred years, took over in the Promised Land. Their last king was Solomon. After Solomon's death, the kingdom split in two parts: Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And a good while later, the northern part, Israel, was taken over by the Assyrians. The southern part, Judah, was taken over by the Babylonians. And at that time, the Babylonians took some of the people of Judah to Babylon as captives. And after some time, the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians. And the Persians allowed those Jews who wanted to return to Judah that were taken captive to return. And they rebuilt the temple. That's what you'll see in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, some did return to Judah, but many did not. They continued to live in Babylon or in Persia. Now, the supposition is that the book of Esther is set in Persia 50 to 100 years after the Persians conquered the Babylonians. And a lot of these people, when the Persians said you can go back to Judah, a lot of them didn't want to go back. And of course, a lot of them had been born in Persia, in Babylon, and they saw that as their home. And so that's where they wanted to stay. And so they had no desire to go back. And biblical scholars believe that the book of Esther is talking about these people, the people that had no desire to go back and just decided to keep making their home there in Persia. Now, Esther was a young woman who lived in Persia, and she was a very young woman, and she was extremely attractive. Her parents had died when she was very young, and she was married. She was raised by her uncle, a man named Mordecai. Now, we heard the beginning of the book of Esther as our reading, and you'll notice that the king had given a big party that lasted 180 days for the men. The queen had given a big party that lasted 180 days for the women. And at the end of that time, the king had a big feast, and he sort of had too much to drink, and he wanted to bring his wife, Queen Vashti, in there and show her off. And for some reason, she said, "No, I'm not coming." And so she refused to come, and that made the king mad. And he asked his advisors, "What should I do?" And they say, well, your wife has disobeyed you, and if you let her get by with this, and it gets out that she's disobeyed you, then all the women in the kingdom will start disobeying their husbands. And they say, you can't let her get by with this. And so the king divorced Vashti, and she would no longer be the queen. He banished her from the kingdom. Now, it wasn't long before the king started missing her, and he regretted he had kicked her out, and he wanted her back. But his advisors came in and they said, no, don't do that. We've got a better idea. Why don't you find a new wife? We'll bring in all the beautiful women from all over the kingdom, and you can select a new wife from one of them. And that's what they did. And the process took a full year. They brought in the most beautiful young women from all over. Now, Esther was one of those women that came in trying to, I guess, audition to be the wife of the king. And her uncle, Mordecai, the one that he raised her, had sort of told her, built her up, said, you need to do this. You need to become the queen here. So she goes. And he said, but you be sure and don't tell anybody that you're a Jew. And so she doesn't. And she goes in there, and out of all the women from everywhere for a full year, the king chooses her for his new wife and his queen. And so she becomes the queen of Persia. Now, Esther's uncle, Mordecai, was an important man in his own right and had a high position. And he had access to many important people, but he kept it a secret that he was Esther's uncle and the one that put her up to going to be the queen. Now, one day, Mordecai overhears a conversation between two men who are plotting to kill the king. And he goes and tells Esther. And she warns the king. And he says, who told you this? And she said, Mordecai. And so the king goes out and he has these two men arrested and executes them. And he's very grateful to Mordecai because he feels Mordecai saved his life. So he has Mordecai's deeds written in the official history books. Now, as time went on, the king appointed a man named Haman to be his second in command. And he ordered everybody, you had to bow down if you saw Haman. Now, for some reason which is not explained, Mordecai, that's Esther's uncle, refused to bow down to Haman. And this makes Haman mad. Now, he knows that Mordecai is a Jew, and he doesn't like Jews anyway, so he goes to the king, and he tells the king all the Jews should be killed. He says they're different, they don't observe the laws, they should not be allowed to live because they will eventually undermine your power if you let them live. And so the king agrees, and he issues an order that on a certain upcoming day, anyone is free to kill whatever Jew they want to kill and take their property. Now Mordecai hears of this, that the date is coming up, and he tells Esther, you've got to go to the king and tell him he can't allow this to happen. Esther's afraid to go, though. Remember, she never told her husband that she is a Jew, and she's afraid if he finds out, she'll have him killed too. And plus, even though she's the queen, she just can't barge in on the king anytime she wants to. She has to be invited to come in. She has to wait until he calls her. And so she's waiting and waiting. He never calls her. And Mordecai gets impatient. He says, you've got to go in. And she says, no, if I go in, he might kill me. He says, well, you've got to do it. So she dresses up in her most beautiful clothes, and she goes into the king, scared to death he'll be mad at her. But he looks around, and he sees how beautiful she is, and he invites her in and is happy that she's in there. And he says, I love you so much that I will grant you one wish. Anything you want, I'll grant you that wish. So she says, I would like to have supper with just you and me and Haman. And the king agrees, and he calls Haman in, and they eat supper together. And after they eat, the king is still so enthralled with her that he says, I'll grant any wish you want. And she says, well, I want us three to have supper again tomorrow night. So the king agrees. Now Haman leaves and he's very proud of himself. He's just had supper with the queen and the king, just the three of them. He's a very important person. On the way home, he meets Mordecai, and Mordecai refuses to bow down to him. And that really just sets Haman on fire. And he goes home and he tells his wife, I've just had dinner with just me and the king and queen, and here I pass this Mordecai, and he refused to bow down to me. And she says, you ought to kill him. So Haman and his son go out, and they build a gallows, and they're going to hang Mordecai on it in order to make an example of him. Now that night, the king is unable to sleep. He's tossing and turning, and he calls some of his servants in, and he says, read to me out of the official history books. And they do. And they get to the part about Mordecai. And when the king heard about that, he realized that he didn't feel like that he had rewarded Mordecai enough for saving his life. And so just about this moment, Haman comes in. He's just finished building the gallows, and he's coming in to tell the king what Mordecai did, and he's fixing to hang him. But before he can speak, the king says, oh, I've got something to ask you. There's somebody that I really want to reward, What would be the best thing to do for him? And Haman thinks it's him. After all, he just had dinner with the king and queen and then got invited for dinner tonight, so he thinks it's him. And he said, well, if it was me, I think what I'd do is I would get the best horse, and I'd dress him in the best clothes, and I'd put him on that best horse dressed in the best clothes, and I'd ride him all around town. And the king likes this suggestion, and he says, that's wonderful, that's what we'll do. Go get Mordecai and do that. Now here Haman came in, wanted to get Mordecai and go hang him, and the king's wanting to put him on the best horse. So this infuriates Haman. But he has to do it since the king told him to. So he goes and he rides Mordecai around on the best horse, and then he goes home. He has to go back that night for supper with the king and queen. And there he's at the supper, and as that supper draws to a close, Esther decides to come clean. She decides to tell the king what happened. She decides to tell the king the truth, that someone wants to kill her and all of her people. And the king is furious about it. He's so mad that he storms out. He's mad at Haman. Well, after the king leaves, here's Haman and Esther in the room together. And Haman starts begging Esther, don't do this, you've got to intervene, don't let him kill me. And she won't have anything to do with him, and he throws himself on her bed to try to convince her, and just at that moment the king walks in, and he sees Haman lying on his wife's bed. And the king orders Haman to immediately be hung from the gallows that Haman and his son erected to hang Mordecai. The king then appoints Mordecai as his new second in command, and Mordecai and Esther work together. The first thing they do is ask the king to rescind his order that so many days hence there'll be a day when anybody who wants to kill a Jew can just kill one and take all their property. But the king says, I can't rescind it. Once a decree has been issued, it cannot be negated. And so they come up with a plan. He'll issue a new decree. And it will say that on that date, any Jew which is attacked by someone trying to kill them and steal their property has the legal authority to kill that person and fight back. Now the day comes when all that's going to happen, and all these people come to try to kill the Jews. The Jews fight back, and they defeat everyone who came to kill them. And then they decide to kill 75,000 more just to take revenge. And Mordecai and Esther declare that from that time on, the Jews are to celebrate 2 days every year, which will be known as the Festival of Purim. And so Mordecai continues on as the king's second in command, and it tells us that he promoted the welfare of the Jews. And that's how the book ends. There's nothing in there about God. There's nothing in there about religion. It is the story of a woman who risked her life to keep other people in her ethnic group from being killed. Judaism in the book of Esther is not presented as a religion. The Jewish people are presented in here as an ethnic group. Esther herself is not portrayed as being religious in any way, and neither is Mordecai. If religion played any part in their lives, it is not mentioned. The book of Esther can be troubling. On one hand, it's the story of a woman who risked her life to save the people in her ethnic group. But on the other hand, it's a story of bloody revenge. The Jews not only defended themselves when people came to kill them, but after they had defended themselves, they killed 75,000 more just for good measure. It was an act of revenge. And of course, it's something that they celebrate every year during the time of Purim. Now, biblical scholars disagree on what this book actually is. Was it intended to be a description of events that actually happened? Or was it intended to be more like just a novel, just like a Mary Kay Andrews book or something? And biblical scholars disagree on that. How was this intended? Was it intended to report events, or is it just a story, a drama of some kind, like a miniature novel? No one knows. Why is it in the Bible? After all, there's nothing in there about God or religion, and Jew in the book of Esther is not referring to religion, it is referring to an ethnic group. Now, we do not know why it's in the Bible, but what it represents is a development within Judaism. If you go back to the book of Exodus and start looking at the beginning of the Jewish people, they came from the Hebrew people, you'll see that the Hebrew people were centered around a certain tract of land, the Promised Land. And their religion basically revolved around them having this piece of land with their own society, their own government. But later, we saw how they lost all that. They got conquered by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and they no longer had that piece of land. And so their home was somewhere else. And so over time, their religion changed. The religion of the Hebrews and the Jews early in the Old Testament is a religion centered on a piece of land. That was their religion, was the piece of land. After they lost that land, though, their religion or their group had to center on something else. And so it centered on observances. They did not longer have a piece of land. They became an ethnic group, and their religion ceased to be a religion, and it became a religion, so to speak, of observances. And so for many Jews, Judaism became not a religion at all, but it was a group of people who maintained their identity as a people by participating in certain rituals every year, repeated every year. Many Jews became defined not by their belief in God, but by the ethnic practices they observed. They celebrated holidays, things like bar mitzvahs, Rosh Hashanah, Hanukkah, Passover, Sabbath. And one of the things was also Purim, and that's from the book of Esther. So their identity became not a religion. Their identity became an ethnic group that participated in certain yearly festivals, certain yearly observances. Now, if you heard the term observant Jew, that is not necessarily a Jew that follows the commandments. That is a Jew that follows the rituals and the observance. Rituals like Purim. And so it's not a major Jewish holiday, Purim is not, but it is celebrated by many Jews. And you remember when we saw the first chapter of Esther, the way they celebrated was drinking a lot. That was what the people were doing when the king and queen were throwing these parties. And so what they do during Purim is they drink a lot. And they are encouraged to drink to excess. And some don't drink to excess, but they're encouraged to drink to excess during these 2 days. And they have certain foods that they eat. They make fried pastries containing poppy seeds and prunes. And these things are shaped in triangles. And they call them Haman's ears. And they eat those to remember that Haman was the bad guy in the story. And they eat seeds and nuts and dumplings filled with chicken liver and served in a bowl of soup. And they also eat certain kinds of breads. So it is a time to eat certain foods and drink to excess. Now, we Christians, of course, do not observe Jewish holidays, but we have our own. And I think one of the reasons this fits so well with this time of year is we are in the season of Lent here. And sometimes for the Chapel of Christ, we do observe the season of Lent, and sometimes we do not. And this is a year that I chose not to observe the season of Lent, and it just sort of dovetailed with this because, Christians have church holidays or church things that they observe. And the seasons of the church year, we've talked about that before, how it starts, and goes through for the year. The liturgical calendar, that is a set of yearly observances, and many Christians observe special days throughout the year. And so, for a lot of people, Christianity also is a religion of observances. And there's nothing wrong with observances, but in the final analysis, Christianity is not about observances. It's not about going to church on Maundy Thursday or going to church on Christmas Eve. It's not about going to sunrise service on Easter morning. It's not about going to church on Good Friday. It's not about any of those things. In the final analysis, Christianity is about how you live your daily life. How you live your daily life. Christianity is not about going through certain rituals and doing certain things and eating certain foods and observing all this and the other. It's about how you live your daily life. You don't go through the ritual and then put that in the closet and go live your life and then get your religion back out of the closet the next time it's time for a ritual. Christianity is a religion that should permeate our everyday lives. It should be lived in the real world. A Christian is not distinguished by how they follow observances. A Christian is distinguished by how they live their daily lives. And as I was thinking about that, I thought, that might be why God and religion are not mentioned in the Book of Esther. Maybe in its own way, it's trying to tell us something. Maybe it's trying to tell us that a religion of observances can be empty without God. A religion of empty rituals, just going through rituals, is not a religion at all. Going through empty religious rituals without God is not a religion. For our gospel reading this morning, we heard Jesus talking about teaching his doctrine, the commandments of men. We heard the Pharisees criticizing Jesus because they did not follow the traditions of the elders. We heard the Pharisees criticizing Jesus because he did not follow the rituals and the observances. And you heard what Jesus said. It's not what you do with your lips and your mouth that matters, but it's your heart. God doesn't want the empty rituals. He wants it to come from the heart.